Hi everyone, welcome to the second video for week number 3. So for this video we're going to be examining two problems with what we're going to call Cartesian interactionism. So we're going to build on the things that we learned about Cartesian dualism in the last video and try to understand why it is that some people think that there is a fundamental problem with Cartesian dualism. It turns out that the problem that they are referring to most often is the problem of Cartesian interactionism, right? So this is a further thesis that Descartes has beyond dualism. So dualism, as we examined in the last video, says that there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances in the world, right? Minds and bodies. Now, Descartes also believes that minds and bodies, despite being essentially different from each other, interact with one another. And Descartes believes that this feature of the interaction between bodies and minds describes the human condition, right? We are finite creatures, right? And in sort of like a traditional Christian belief, but we resemble God in some respects, right? Just like God is free and is a thinking being, so too human beings as created in his image are also thinking beings and also free, right? Descartes says it's especially in our freedom in the will that we truly resemble God, right? The infinity of God. Because our decisions, our will is not limited by anything in the physical world, right? And this is revealed by phenomena like when people martyr themselves, right? You can decide that you don't really care what happens to your body, right? And say you want to, have a political message, either like Christ or, you could point out now like protesters that burn themselves in front of various political buildings, right, in the United States. These are both cases where people are completely willing to forsake their body for something determined by their will or their mind. And this is what inspires us in these kinds of figures for Descartes, is that they are not sort of bound by the vicissitudes of this world, right? And this, is what provides us great admiration for these kind of martyr figures, right? So Descartes' account of the will, then, is the belief that our mind can cause our body in certain respects, right? And this is what Descartes called voluntary action. And so here we can think about the interaction between body and mind as proceeding from mind to body, right? Mind decides lift right arm, body receives order, right, or whatever, you lift arm, right? And that in cases of voluntary action, right, where the actions of our body express our will, this is what happens, right? This is a very common sense belief, and this is one that Descartes holds. Similarly, another aspect of Descartes' interactionism comes in with the idea of sensation, right? This is one way that our body comes to affect our mind, right? Okay, fixed. Yeah, so that's one way. Sensation is a way that bodies come to affect our minds. We form representations, right? Mental images of things through the way that they come to affect our senses, right? And thinkers of this period were very interested in that, right? Galileo was very interested in heat, right? Because he wanted to say, well, what is heat? What is that sensation? What is the physical thing that causes it? And these were very live questions for the period. So the essential puzzle, whether you take it in one direction or the other, we're going to look at both of them today, is how can two things that are fundamentally different and have different modes of interaction cause one another? Right? How do they interact? How is voluntary action possible? How is sensation possible if you agree with Descartes and the Cartesians? And this problem is taken up by the two figures that we're going to be discussing in more depth today, Princess Elizabeth and Anton Wilhelm Amo. Now, these figures are truly fascinating figures in the canon of early modern philosophy. Just to give you a little bit of biographical information about each of them before we go into their objections to Cartesian dualism. Princess Elizabeth was a correspondent of Descartes. She did not write like long philosophical treatises of her own, but she was an astute and very learned person. And it was not a normal thing for women to be interacting with published philosophical works, right? It was considered by many to be unwomanly, unbecoming, especially as somebody that is, nobility in some respect, right? For you to engage in like this kind of like mannish behavior. And at the time of her life where Elizabeth is corresponding with Descartes, she's depressed, frankly. She's like not in a good place in her life, and like part of the reason why she reaches out to Descartes is kind of to be like, hey, can you help me, right? Like I desperately want to feel more in control of my emotions, and it kind of feels like your theory should have something to say about that. And so like, can you help? Basically, and it's really by thinking about emotions and voluntary actions that Elizabeth comes to the most profound and important objection to Descartes that he ever encounters in his entire life, right? Recall that when he published the Meditations, he published it with a selection of objections and replies. And he is not above being catty in those replies. When he thinks lowly on his interlocutor, he is very happy to say so. But that is not how he treats Princess Elizabeth. It's actually kind of surprising how well, essentially, Descartes treats Princess Elizabeth. I mean, he seems to genuinely think of her as a philosophical equal, and he is really spurred, as we're going to see in more detail, by the questions that she poses to him, which he admits he did not really sufficiently address in the Meditations. And he actually writes an entire new book dealing directly with this problem that we're going to talk more about in the next video, called The Passions of the Soul, right? So it's a way of thinking about our emotions, the way of thinking about the fact that our mind is embodied, right? And he dedicates that work to Princess Elizabeth because she was really the impetus for his thoughts in this respect. So she's very important. She's very important for Descartes. there was a very long period where she was in some ways like just kind of written out of the history, because there's a tendency to focus on, you know, the big figures like Descartes, right? But that led to us for a very long time misunderstanding the nature of the problem, right? Because we were looking in all these other places when for Descartes the real crux of the issue, right, was articulated by Elizabeth, not some other masculine figure that we are apt to look for, right? And similarly, Amo is a very fascinating philosopher. He comes a little bit later than the philosophers that we've looked at so far. He's in the 18th century. Like, I think that the text that this is a selection from was published, I believe, around the 1740s. So that's about 100 years after Descartes. And he's fascinating in part because he is one of the only black philosophers of this period. Um, you know, that thinking about his work really gives us opportunity to think about the fact that, you know, the vast majority of the figures that we're going to be reading are, you know, essentially aristocratic white men in Europe, right? And there's a reason for that, the existing power structures in Europe, right? And in Amo's case, it is particularly salient because he was essentially kidnapped and enslaved as a kind of enlightenment experiment. And if that sounds disgusting, that's because it is, right? They essentially wanted to see, you know, as this faux enlightenment, anti-racism, like, oh, if we were to raise a black child in nobility, like he was taken under by a baron, essentially, and teach him philosophical texts, will he produce philosophical material too as an African and as a black man from Ghana, right? And it turns out the sick test in some ways was successful, and he did produce philosophical texts. He even, I believe, was one of the first black professors in Germany. He worked at the University of Vienna for a time. And so he is a very fascinating figure. He also, you know, criticized European colonialism, and so he's interesting in that respect as well. Of course, here we're not going to be dealing with as much of the ethical and political stuff, so we're not going to be examining that in detail, right? But it's important background for both of these figures, right? They were only able to enter the canon as marginal figures, right? Elizabeth as a correspondent with Descartes, and Amo really only rediscovered somewhat recently, right? As we've begun to reconsider the fact that the canon is almost exclusively like aristocratic white Christian men, and like really trying to think, is that all who wrote in this period? And it turns out no, right? The period is actually more interesting than the previous historical story that we told ourselves about it, right? And that's my experience reading philosophy essentially all the time, right? But okay, so we have Princess Elizabeth and we have Amo, and they're going to critique Cartesian interactionism from both sides, essentially, of the interaction. So let's dive into it. The first letter that you read in your textbook outlines the fundamental nature of the problem. Essentially, here, Elizabeth, I've written an E here, she asks, how can the soul of a man determine the bodily spirits to make voluntary actions? The soul being only a thinking substance. Okay, so essentially, Elizabeth's question is this, right? If the soul is not in space, how is it attached to a thing in space? Right? And this is very important. For Descartes, we think about our soul as being contained in our body, right? In some way, right? That's why, like, I can immediately act on my own body, I can force it to do things, but, like, I don't have psychic powers, right? Like, my soul can't, like, lift up a book and, like, throw it across the room or anything like that, right? And it also seems like all of the activities of my body are constrained by physical laws, right? Like, I can't, like, kamehameha and, like, burst out a bunch of energy just from my hands, or anything like that. Like, no, everything that my soul can do is limited, at least in the physical world, right, by what the body can do, right? So the puzzle is, if Descartes is truly correct and the soul does not have the nature of the body in any respects, how can it be connected to a body? And how, specifically, in voluntary action, do we cause things in the physical world with our minds, right? It seems like Descartes is in danger of making the mind, right, something like occult, right, or mysterious. Occult is like spooky, you know what I mean? Like something that we fundamentally cannot explain, right? And that's not what philosophy is meant to do. Philosophy is meant to explain things, right? So, she says your theory, right? Your theory of bodies, your theories of extended things, says that only motion can impart motion, right? So, like, I cannot. You don't see motion imparted from nowhere. You don't see, like, my ability to slam a home run because I'm not strong enough, right? Only motion can impart further motion, right? If that is true, how can the soul impart motion, given that the soul has no extension and hence has no motion, right? And then, Elizabeth says something really profoundly interesting too, that is also very instrumental in the development of philosophy of mind from this period. She says, it's easier for me to imagine that the soul is something material that imparts motion and so on, than it is for me to imagine that the soul is something completely distinct from bodies that then interacts with bodies. And this is the direction that a lot of people want to take philosophy of mind, right? Stop thinking about the mind as something disembodied, not in space, and so on, right? And start thinking of the mind as an effect of the brain or something like that, or it just is the brain, right? Theories like that, theories that have a more intimate connection to the thing that we can understand, right? The brain. It seems like the mind is this thing that we have so much trouble understanding, because it's like, how can the mind exist in a physical world if it seems like the mind's relations are not like physical relations, right? And Elizabeth's thesis at the end of the day is to kind of bet, essentially, that, well, actually the mind probably is embodied in some deep way, right? It has to have something more of an intimate connection with the brain to be able to genuinely make sense of, like, how it is that voluntary action works. Now Descartes tries to reply, and he tries to be like, you're right, I did not explain this in the Sixth Meditation, and I haven't explained it in my philosophical work, and also that to some extent we just don't understand voluntary motion. he says, like, in the same way that we don't really understand how gravity works, essentially, right? We just know it's a fundamental force in the universe. And you're welcome to replace this with whatever contemporary analog you would like. So too, we don't really know how soul-body interaction works, but it is evident that it occurs in the same way that it is evident that gravity occurs, right? And so this is how he tries to respond to Elizabeth, right? And Elizabeth is not satisfied with this account, right? Why is it not satisfying? Well, because Descartes is trying to disguise a philosophical problem as being a physical problem, right? Our lack of understanding of gravity or whatever is a physical problem, right? It's not that gravity is inconceivable. It's that we don't understand it, right? And those are two fundamentally different things. But the case of voluntary action, right? It seems inconceivable that something that is not in space can impart motion into the body, right? And, philosophers of mind and neuroscientists will tend to have this kind of bafflement in response to you if you're like, yeah, but what about voluntary actions? Like, don't I cause something to happen in the physical world, like with my ideas, right? Doesn't that, they would scoff at you, like, what are you talking about? Like, what do you mean something happening in your mind causing neurons to interact? Neurons interact with physical laws, right? And what determines how they behave is not whatever BS that you happen to be thinking that day, right? What determines how they interact are certain physical laws and biology and facts about the brain and so on and so forth, right? And so they're going to really poo-poo this Cartesian idea of the mind or the soul, right? They're going to say this is the old-timey aspect of Descartes' theory, where he was still making these concessions to a religious tradition that we no longer feel is necessary, right? This is the attitude that people have towards Descartes in that respect, especially in like philosophy of mind and neuroscience, right? Okay, so Princess Elizabeth, like basically in a tweet, right? That's like 240 characters-ish, right? Is able to destroy this Cartesian theory, right? There are more people basically now sympathetic to Princess Elizabeth's point of view than there ever have been in history. It may be the single most held position that we're going to be discussing in the entire early modern tradition, right? This objection to Descartes is so powerful that it has convinced philosophers essentially for 400 years. And it is extraordinarily rare for any philosophical doctrine or thesis to have that kind of staying power, especially when it comes from somebody that is historically excluded from the canon, right? So really, really fascinating stuff, really interesting. And we're going to see the parallel of this argument come from Amma, right? Who is also going to be making points that are very, very salient for thinking about philosophy of mind from a non-Cartesian, anti-Cartesian perspective. And essentially what Amma argues is that the apathy of the human mind is unexplained by Cartesian dualism. And that immediately raises the question, what does Amma mean by apathy? And I've written that down here. Apathy is the way that we receive sensation. So it's called apathy, right? Apathy is like you don't want to do anything, right? So like rather than doing stuff, rather than imposing your will on the world, instead, this is the way that you receive the world, the way that the world comes to impact your own mind, your own decision making, and so on, right? And so if Elizabeth said, hey Descartes, you make this direction of mind-body interaction make no sense, right? Voluntary action. Now Alma was focusing on the opposite direction, right? Sensation, the way that we receive the world, rather than the way that we come to act in the world. And you can see too how all of these problems are related to issues about human freedom too. I just want to bring that up, right? How does our mind, this aspect of ourselves that we think of as free, interact with the world, which we think about as being constrained by physical laws and so on and so forth, right? Okay. And so Alma says, this is actually a quote, I should have written quotation marks. Let's write this down. Alma says in the beginning of the text that we're reading, human beings sense material things not with the mind, but through a living, organic body. So what does Alma mean by this? So, importantly for Descartes, only the mind has representations. Only the mind knows what it's like for something to be something, right? Like, there's nothing that the world is like to a rock, right? Rocks do not have stances, orientations towards the world. They don't perceive it in any way, right? They're physical objects, they're bodies, they're rocks. They do not have sensations, right? They do not have minds. This thesis actually also led Descartes to claiming that animals do not have minds. Why? Well, he dissected animals, right? He cut them up, right? And he was like, okay, here's how, animals leap or, do whatever else. It turns out that it's these muscles and tendons, and you have electrical signals that get sent through them, and, they move, right? They contract and expand, and that's how muscles work, and that's how animal movement works. And so you can explain all of an animal's behavior purely through appealing to the nature of bodies, right? And so Descartes literally believed that animals were just extremely complex machines created by God, right? That's kind of a crazy person thing to think. That is what he thought. That's what he thought was the result of modern physics and his own dissections. And he also believed that, the mind is the same thing as the soul, right? If you have souls for each and every animal, that's a lot of souls, right? And, then you have to start explaining, well, how are animal minds different from human minds? If we have minds because we're created in the image of God, then what is the difference between human beings and animals, right? There are all these theological, political, ethical questions that would be opened if Descartes claimed that animals had a soul. So, he says they don't, right? And you can explain everything about animal behavior purely through, efficient causal stuff. He was basically an early Pavlovian, right? Pavlov thought, he thought you could condition animals to certain responses through certain stimuli, right? You ring a bell, the dog begins to salivate because every time previously they had been fed by that. And Descartes would say, see, this is proof, right? This is proof that animal minds are governed only by these efficient causal relations that obtain between bodies. Of course, even during the period, people called this absurd, right? It makes sense that you want to avoid all of these theological problems, whatever, right? But it seems like if you, that same method of explanation that you used for animal minds, like, oh, I can explain all of their behavior just through efficient causal stuff, it seems like you could do that with other human beings too, right? So like, why am I raising my arm, right? The traditional explanation that we gave before was, oh, it was my soul impugning motion onto my body and so on, right? Now, if you were to dissect me, you would just find muscles, right? In the same way that when you dissected the animals, you just found muscles and fat and blood and so on, right? Bodies, right? We didn't find mind. Cut it all up. No mind to be found, right? And so one thing that Amo does is he draws attention to the fact that, okay, it might be the case that animals don't reason like us, right? Like they don't come to mathematical knowledge or anything like that, but they definitely sense things like us. Like, come on, the dogs have representations of trees and treats and other dogs and squirrels and so on, right? It's not the case that they're just robots and all of these stimuli are the same or like predetermined or something like that, right? When an animal senses something, that doesn't happen through the mind, it happens through an organic body, right? And, like we mentioned in the last video, you can discover things about that through natural science, right? Like natural science can explain why a dog's nose is so much more powerful than ours, why a dog's sense of hearing is so much more powerful than ours, right? And so Amo is convinced that Cartesian interactionism must be wrong because Cartesian interactionism believes that when we sense things, we're doing that with our minds in some ways instead of with our bodies. When it's so evident that that is a kind of bodily interaction, right? Okay, and so to conclude, one thing that's really fascinating when you think about Princess Elizabeth and Amo is that feminist traditions in philosophy, black traditions in philosophy will often try to think about limitations of Cartesian dualism, right? Limitations on the basis that that it fails to account for some aspect of bodily experience, right? And what the really cool part is that you don't even need to leave the period, right? To get these kind of objections to Descartes. It's not like we need to go 200 years into the future to wait for someone intelligence or something to make these objections. No, these objections are actually made by people in the period, right? And so it's really, really fascinating. And to me, this is sort of an aspect of my teaching and my pedagogy. It's like, yes, on one hand, right, the early modern tradition is very white, it is very European, and so on. That is undeniable, right? There's no point in trying to write Descartes out of the canon or write out his Christianity or anything like that, right? But we can see already within the tradition itself these moments of profound objection, and even from places that are excluded, right? Princess Elizabeth gets excluded from the canon. Amo gets excluded from the canon. Soon we're going to be talking about Spinoza. Spinoza was somebody who was excommunicated, and his work was burned. And so you can already see, the period itself, even though it does have this aspects of its canon that are closed, it already contains within itself these moments of rupture and contesting, right, of those very structures themselves, right, and attacking the theoretical aspects of the work that they believe are connected with that political order as well. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope that you all have a great week. Bye.